Okay, so the sound, based on the tests I've just done, seems to have rejuvenated. I really don't know why it goes up and down, but anyway, it's good that it's on the up right now. It's late at night here in the UK, early hours of the morning, about 5 a.m. Uh, I'm in my night owl phase, staying up late as usual. Um, I've just listened to a debate on Radio 5. I don't often listen to radio, but I came across this, and it was a debate on Brexit. And the studio audience was divided between Remainers and Leavers. Inevitably, it got quite heated. I don't know where the location was, it wasn't mentioned, but it got quite heated and it got me thinking about some of the things that are dividing us as a people. And it's really unfortunate. Um, One thing that I found interesting and predictable was that a lady spoke out. She was a leaver and she was a nurse, and she mentioned the fact that she was concerned about immigration because what was happening was foreign nurses were filling some of the positions, and I think she mentioned that she had a child who wanted to get into that. I forget the exact story, but immediately when she started talking about this, there was heckles and boos from the Remain people in the audience, and this woman wasn't sort of voicing hatred against foreign nurses. She was simply stating a fact. And I know that's a fact because my mother is a nurse, retired now. But my mother certainly testified to some of that going on. There was foreign nurses filling positions in the NHS. And, they do the job all nurses do, which is a very respectable and noble thing, saving lives. But that attitude that people had, the second she started speaking and the second she used the I word, immigration, there was heckles. That's something that really I find very unfortunate. And unfortunately, it's a mentality that pervades among many of my fellow Remainers and many on the political left. Not that it's as simple as Remain equals left wing and Leave equals right wing. It's not that simple, although it seems to be going down those lines. But I want it to be known that there are people on the Remain side that also have concerns about immigration. Now, if your attitude to immigration is to heckle someone every time the word is even mentioned, how can we ever have any progress in terms of dialogue? That pisses me right off. I don't like heckling generally. I think it's childish. I don't think it's a way to conduct a debate. But anyway, the whole thing got very heated, and I heard ignorant comments on both sides. I heard ignorant comments on the Leave side as well. Um, One thing I find stubborn about the Leave side is this attitude that we voted out, now just accept it. And it's this kind of that mentality that because the Remain side, people on the Remain side lost, they therefore can't ask questions. I think there is legitimacy in young people asking questions about the future. One thing, though, I don't like that has been part of the trajectory of this debate is that the Remain side is educated, the Leave side isn't. Now, supposedly there's been some studies done into this. There may be some truth in it insofar as being university educated, but I think Remain people who keep pushing that line need to understand that frankly it comes across as quite snobby. I didn't I didn't graduate university. I voted Remain. And I know there are university educated people who voted Leave. I think the problem is the two sides fail to understand how they are seen. I think the Remain side fails to understand that they are seen as, to be fair, one young guy did touch on this. He said, we're kind of seen as clinging on to something. Um, I do think there's too many on the Remain side fail to understand that they are seen not as being open minded, but as kind of dewy eyed, almost seeing the EU like a cult. Like any criticism of it is illegitimate, and it's almost like this blind praise of the EU. Unfortunately, there are some on the Remain side who have that mindset. So to be clear, I have never ever supported a European superstate, never, and I never would. I think that is a disastrous idea. I don't think it would work. For one thing, I mean, I have a Spanish friend and I agree with him on a lot of things, but I disagree with him on that. For one thing, who would determine the capital? Who would determine the language? It would never work. I do believe in a partnership of nations, for sure. And I do think we have to be grateful in Europe that we have enjoyed more peace than any other part of the world for 60 years. Although, to be fair, leavers would argue that it was NATO that secured that, not the EU. Um, there's a lot of things that can be said about this, and I'm sure, as with many of my in depth videos, there are going to be things that I want to say that I'm not going to say in this video, because it would go on forever if I said everything I really want to say. But I feel that if we're to go forward as a nation, first of all, I think it's legitimate for the Remain side to ask questions. It's legitimate for people like me to say what's going to happen with this. And I do think it's fair to say that there hasn't been very many satisfactory answers from the Leave side. There's kind of vague assurances, and there's kind of like, oh, don't complain, you lost, we won, now move on. But like I say, this wasn't a general election, this is a permanent thing. And it will affect future generations, so it's totally legitimate to ask challenging questions. But I would also say to my fellow Remainers, put things in context. We were in the European Union for 44 years. It's a long time, but in the history of this country, it is relatively short. In the history of Europe, it's relatively short. And stop kidding yourselves by thinking that the EU didn't have problems, because it did. Had many problems. I do have concerns about this. One of my main concerns, actually, is on universities. The reason being, I am concerned that international students are going to be put off coming to Britain because they feel, I don't like all of May's immigration policies. I think this idea of including international students in with regular immigration figures, I think that's a big mistake, because international students contribute to the economy. Um, and they contribute to our cultural life. And to be quite frank, I would be very sad if we saw a great reduction in international students. I have met some of my best friends, people I deeply care about, through the international student body. So I would be very sad if there was a situation where international students felt we're not welcome in Britain, we don't want to go there. I'm not saying that will be the case, but I think it's a mistake for the Prime Minister to lump all, because she seems to be doing that, putting every outsider in a single unit. And you can't do that with immigration. You have to look at um, each sector in its own merit. So international students are not the same as asylum seekers. Asylum seekers are not the same as foreign workers, and so on. And I may be wrong about this, but she seems to be, and the Conservative Party under her leadership seem to be just looking at it as one big immigration bloc. I don't want to see a situation where Britain is seen as a hostile destination. That's in no one's interest. But by the same token, what everyone needs to understand, what Remainers need to understand, and frankly, what our international friends need to understand, is that Britain, like any country, has a right to have some vetting of who comes into this country, not least because of counterterrorism. But it isn't just about counterterrorism, it's also about integration. That is something I believe very strongly in. Now, in my opinion, there are some people on the political left who are very, very naive about this. And I honestly think they really would advocate unlimited, unchecked immigration. In my opinion, that is not a humane ideology, it's an incredibly reckless ideology. Last year, when I was going to attend a local count, actually I didn't because I didn't have the paperwork. But I met Graham, and he was Polish. Um, Nice enough guy. We made small talk, but his whole attitude to immigration was if you mention the word, and he got really sarcastic. Like he was kind of mocking UKIP and saying, "Oh, there's an immigrant there. There's an immigrant under the table," and he was mocking this idea that those on the rights, from his perspective, were always talking about immigration. Now, on one hand, I understand his perspective, but on the other hand, we are geographically a small country. We're only 79th in area in the world, yet we're number 22 by population, 65 million plus. Um, That's not to say that Britain is absolutely full, but we are actually, by definition, quite a densely populated country. If you look at the UN index of population density, we are actually similar to some parts of China, and that's not an exaggeration. So, anyone who believes in absolutely unlimited immigration without serious checks is a fool. There's nothing humane about that for anybody. It's not humane for people coming in because that then makes them the scapegoats. Um, Actually, Nick Clegg in the Lib Dems suggested something which was, I thought, quite practical. What he said was, I can't remember if it was in the last general election or the general election before that, and it may surprise some of my right wing viewers, but he did say this. He said there should be less of an immigration intake on areas where there is higher economic problems, such as unemployment and so on, because in those cases, that's where tensions will then arise. And it's no coincidence that the highest vote leave percentage was in Boston and Skegness, which, as I understand it, is an area of quite high social deprivation. And there's been a real market change in the demographics of that constituency. So I really don't blame local people for being anxious. So, what I would say to my left wing viewers, with all due respect, the whole country isn't the same. You know, you may be coming from a point where everything's rosy to you, but to someone who is living in a small town like Boston, Lincolnshire, who sees the situation change so drastically over a relatively short period of time, I don't blame them for being concerned. I really don't. And the fact of the matter is, there are some people, and I want to be careful how I say this because I've known people from Central and Eastern Europe who have been thoroughly decent people. But there are others who, frankly, don't integrate. They're not really interested in British values. They come here solely for work and then to go home. Now, I really, really believe that if you live in a country, you have to integrate. What does that mean? It means speaking a basic, reasonable standard of English. I'm not saying you have to speak the Queen's English, but it has to be reasonable. And, you know, I would hold exactly the same principle for Britons working in other countries. If I want to settle down in a country for a significant period of time, I would understand that I had to learn the language. That's common sense. It's not racist. It's just common sense and it makes things easier for everyone. But it isn't just about that. It's also, I don't have much respect for people who go to a country, and again, I include Britons in this, and they just want to make a little micro version of their own culture without integrating into the host nation. It shouldn't be controversial to say that because there's nothing wrong with diversity. There's nothing wrong with having a taste of all the cultures. I'm fine with that. You know, I buy products from my local Chinese store. I've been to the local Polish shop. That's great. Wonderful. I'm not hostile to that at all. However, I am hostile to this mentality that you go to a country and you just create a little mini version of your own country. You never associate with local people. To me, that is a very narrow minded attitude. And some Britons do the same thing in certain parts of Spain, for example. So I really believe in integration, and it should not be racist to say that. And one thing I detest about the left is the way they automatically get into this defensive attitude that if you discuss these things, oh, you must be a little Englander. I consider myself an international, so I'm well travelled. I have friends from all over the world, but these are basic principles. And these things are all relevant now. To anyone from other parts of Europe who might be watching this, I don't want you to feel like you're not wanted here. I really, really don't want that. You know, anyone who's travelled in another country knows that it can be slightly intimidating when you're an outsider, when you don't necessarily speak the language. So I would absolutely, and personally, I always go out of my way to make people feel welcome. You know, when I meet someone from another country, I speak to them. I try to make them feel at ease. I say, you're welcome here. I really do. Um, but I also would expect that they would at least make some efforts to kind of adapt to our society. both ways. Certainly works both ways. I mean, you can't expect people to adapt if they then face racist abuse. And about racism, the Leave side does downplay it to some extent. There is definitely racism there. There is definitely racism among the Leave side. And those responsible Leavers need to condemn that unreservedly. It is unacceptable that anyone is made to feel unwelcome or frightened to leave their home because either they're from another part of Europe or because of the colour of their skin. Now, the Leave side will say we've always had racism, but I do think it's fair to say that it has been somewhat exacerbated by all of this. So, what I would politely say to the Leave side is you also need to show responsibility and reassure foreigners living in the UK that we're not going to treat them like aliens. We're not going to treat them like, because in many cases they have been here for years. They've contributed to our society in many ways. They have integrated. And the fact of the matter is, we're a diverse country. We cannot pretend that we aren't. We always have been. We are a trading nation. We've always been diverse. There's a lot I can say about this. I'm going to round this up pretty soon, but that debate, to be honest, just highlighted the polarizing views that are out there. I think there are reasonable people on both sides, but both sides also need to be responsible. So the Remain side have to stop. I've seen some absurd comments today treating all Leavers like they're horrible, narrow-minded, racist bigots. That's stupid. It's unfair. And concerns about immigration do not equate to racism. Having said that, there is some racism on the Leave side. People who just don't like foreigners. And responsible Leavers need to challenge that mentality as well. Responsible Leavers also need to accept that simply asking questions about Brexit doesn't mean that we're being undemocratic. I accept the result. It was a majority decision for Leave. But I'll sum it up this way. There is responsibility on both sides. Now, as someone who voted Remain, I won't be told by anybody that I don't love my country and that I'm a liberal elitist, because I do love my country and I'm not a liberal elitist. But I also expect my fellow Remainers not to be so narrow-minded and always dismiss legitimate grievances people have as racism. If you live in Boston, Lincolnshire, you might have a different perspective as opposed to, I don't know, living in a metropolitan university in West London, for example. So I don't think we should doommonger either way. We're leaving. It's not the end of the world. It really isn't. Now, if the UK broke up, that would be a totally different matter as far as I'm concerned, because that should be the breakup of this country. And yeah, if that happens, I would be miserable as hell, and I wouldn't hide it. But so far, from what I can see, it's passed in the Scottish Parliament. But I think Nicola Sturgeon scored an own goal with this one, and I think she knows it. So I'm cautiously optimistic that isn't going to happen. But I do think it is essential that Theresa May reassure our European friends living in the UK that they're not going to be treated like outsiders. They're not going to be punished. They're not going to be scapegoated. Look, there's going to be a lot of questions and a lot of other things to say. I'll leave it there. But that's how I'm feeling at the moment. I'm not particularly happy about this. But I'm not going to wallow in misery and think, oh, well, it's the end of the world. It's not the end of the world. This is a great nation. We're still a great nation, and we will always be a great nation. Unless we break up, which would be the worst scenario. But that's how I feel about it. I love my country, but I am a passionate European, and I make no apology for either. Thank you for watching.